Yugoslavia was aligned with the Soviet Union for a time after World War II, although the alignment didn't last long, and although Yugoslav-Soviet relations in the Cold War era were often rocky. In 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, they improved greatly. But that came to an end in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union broke up. Today, President Putin of Russia has some deeply emotional views about the recent history of Yugoslavia. He says that what he did in Crimea is no different than what the West did in Yugoslavia. And on this subject, his words are very compelling.
Revelation, as I've said before, is the principal book of prophecy in the New Testament of the Bible.
The Key of David with Gerald Fleury.
Greetings, everyone. Vladimir Putin says that the breakup of that Soviet Union was one of the greatest crisis of the 20th century. Now, that is his view, of course, but what happened to Yugoslavia after it became independent of the Soviet Union is what really fills Vladimir Putin with wrath and even rages on today. Now, we need to know why. Why was he so upset about what happened in Yugoslavia? Now, it all started in the early 1990s and then on into the early part of 2000. And it's really involving the U.S. He blames the U.S., first of all. But then, of course, the U.S. used its military power and might to conquer Yugoslavia and then handed it over to Germany. So America and Germany don't like to talk about that beginning very much, but I want to present you with some facts today, and I mean they are all facts. It's not about emotion. It's not about a political view. I'm just looking at the facts, and I hope you'll join me in doing that and see what really happened to Yugoslavia and why Vladimir Putin is so enraged today about that. I mean, still in this modern era. So my booklet on Germany's conquest of the Balkans tells you all about that, and it's a really critical, vital book. And I don't think there's ever been a better booklet written about that event than the one entitled Germany's Conquest of the Balkans, which included, of course, Yugoslavia. But Vladimir Putin remembers that, and he remembers it, and it's etched in his memory, and he can't forget it, he won't forget it. But we need to know why. Why is he so upset about all of that? Well, I think America and Germany would both like to see him forget all about that, but he will not. And I'm going to present you with what we wrote years ago, added to a little knowledge we've had recently. But I want to begin giving you a quote from Vladimir Putin as he addressed the Russian Federation March the 18th, 2014, just a short time ago. Here's what he said, and this is a quote that you need to get to understand the context of what's going on here. He said, as it declared independence and decided to hold a referendum, the Supreme Council of Crimea referred to the United Nations Charter and speaks of the right of nations to self-determination. Incidentally, I would like to remind you that when Ukraine seceded from the USSR, or the Soviet Union, it did exactly the same thing, almost word for word. Ukraine used this right, yet the residents of Crimea are denied it. Why is that? Why is that happening? Well, he goes on to say, moreover, the Crimean authorities referred to the well-known Kosovo precedent, a precedent our Western colleagues created with their own hands in a very similar situation when they agreed with the unilateral separation of Kosovo from Serbia. That's the leading state of Yugoslavia, Serbia is. And he says separation of Kosovo from Serbia, exactly what Crimea is doing now, was legitimate and did not require any permission from the country's central authorities. Pursuant to Article 2, Chapter 1 of the United Nations Charter, the UN International Court agreed with this approach and made the following comment in its ruling of July 22, 2010, and I quote, here's the quote, "No general prohibition may be inferred from the practice of the Security Council with regard to declarations of independence, and general international law contains no prohibition on declarations of independence." Now he says, now isn't that crystal clear? And I think it is. And I just want to give you one more paragraph here and not burden you down with too much reading, but you have to have some of this history and some of the statements Mr. Putin is making today to really understand this. Here's what he said in conclusion. I do not like to resort to quotes, but in this case I cannot help it. Here is a quote from another official document, the written statement of the United States of America, April 17, 2009, submitted to the same UN International Court in connection with the hearings on Kosovo. That's a part of Yugoslavia. Again, I quote, here's the quote, "Declarations of independence may and often do violate domestic legislation. However, this does not make them violation of international law." This is what the United States said. End of quote. They wrote this, disseminated it all over the world, had everyone agree, and now they are outraged. Over what? The actions of Crimean people completely fit in with these instructions as if it were, for some reason, things that Kosovo Albanians, and we have full respect for them, were permitted to do. Russians, Ukrainians, and Crimean Tatars in Crimea are not allowed. Again, one wonders why. We keep hearing from the United States and Western Europe that Kosovo is some special case. What makes it so special in the eyes of our colleagues? It turns out that it is the fact that the conflict in Kosovo resulted in many human casualties, which it certainly did. And Kosovo was tied to the Yugoslav country at that time. But notice this statement, which is really quite astounding, and one we ought to be concerned about because it's aimed directly at the United States, that is, those of us who are Americans. But he said this, "Our Western partners, led by the United States of America, prefer not to be guided by international law in their practical policies, but by the rule of the gun." But the America, he said, is led by the rule of the gun, guided by that. Now, the conquering of Yugoslavia was led by the U.S. military power, and it was through NATO, and most of that power was from the U.S. that absolutely blasted Yugoslavia, or in the Serbs in particular, into smithereens, you could say. It was a terrible attack, and it was all orchestrated by Germany, of all things. What is that? What was really going on then? What was really happening? This has everything to do with the development of what is called the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, and you'll see that from the prophecies we have in this booklet that we want to send you, and I hope every single one of you will read it because it is as powerful as any little booklet I've ever written about world news and about what happened certainly in Yugoslavia. But Germany now controls the former Yugoslavia. They controlled that and the Kosovo and the entire Balkan Peninsula. And so what were we involved for? Well, we didn't get anything out of it but a bad reputation and a lot of hatred from Vladimir Putin. But we provided the military power. That's why President Putin says that America is guided by the law of the gun. Now, look, I'm just telling you, you can make a good case for that if you look at the facts, but people have never looked at the facts and what happened in the Balkans and to Yugoslavia. They've never, ever done that for the most part. And I'm talking to you about facts. The America's Secretary of State said, or has accused Russia of living in the 19th century and not acting like someone living in the 21st century. But I submit to you, and I think you can prove this with documents galore, that the crime against Yugoslavia was far worse than that crime against Crimea by the Russians. And I hope you will prove this to yourself, because there were a lot of things going on here that were so mysterious and so absolutely shameful that Germany and America don't like to discuss it, even to this day. Serbia, the leading little state within Yugoslavia, fought with the United States in 2 world wars. They were our allies, and we bombed them into defeat. And because we allied ourselves with Germany, under a lot of pressure from Germany, who was our enemies in World War I and World War II, and they started both of those wars. And they're going to start World War III in the same fashion. That's what your Bible says. That's what it says. Now, something is wrong here about how that all developed and how it all happened. Let me read one last quote from what Mr. Putin spoke at this federation. Here's what he said, quote, "To make this aggression look legitimate, they forced the necessary resolutions from international organizations. And if for some reason this does not work, they simply ignore the UN Security Council, which is, of course, Russia has a veto in that Security Council, so they just ignored it." Now, that is a fact. And the UN overall, they just ignore everything. He said, "This happened in Yugoslavia. We remember 1999 very well," he says. We remember that. It was hard to believe, even seeing it with my own eyes, that at the end of the 20th century, one of Europe's capitals, Belgrade, that's the capital of Yugoslavia, was under missile attack for several weeks, and then came the real intervention. Was there a UN Security Council resolution on this matter allowing for these actions? Nothing of the sort. Russia didn't even have an opportunity to give their input. And now we want input on Russia's interfering and taking over the Crimea, which is, again, mostly inhabited by Russians. But Russia has veto power in that Security Council, and of course they were left out. But the thing about it is this. When Vladimir Putin says, look, we remember 1999, we remember what happened, he's saying that they not only remember it, but they have deep emotional feelings about it. And he still rages about that today. Now, we wrote all about this exactly as it happened in a booklet that was written 15 years ago. Germany's conquest of the Balkans, and that's what it is. Let's call it what it is. Now, let me give you another very prominent source here. This is the Corsi intelligence brief, and let him tell you what happened, a little bit of what happened. And here's what he said. It is a mystery. It is a mystery as to why Western policymakers did not understand the resentments that had been building up in Moscow, and that Ukraine represented a red line for Russia. Now you see, again, Mr. Putin is still enraged. And And he said, the only mystery, it's a mystery here why the West doesn't understand why they were so infuriated by what happened in Yugoslavia. Now, it's a mystery, but it shouldn't be. And we explain why in our booklet. We explain that to you. Resentment that the Russians have to this day, and they take a certain delight in what happened in Crimea, that is for the most part, but I'll tell you for certain that rage is still burning within Vladimir Putin. And now he has a lot of power and a strong memory about what happened in Yugoslavia. And he's going to remember that the rest of his life. And he says, look, America is guided by the rule of the gun. Now, when you just look at Yugoslavia, you could say, well, now I guess he does have a point. He does really have a point. What was America doing, bombing the country that had these Serbian allies in World War I and World War II and helped Germany conquer them, which they couldn't do in World War II. I think that's a pretty serious concern, and I think if we're honest, we'll look at these facts, and I would just challenge you to do that. Please do that. You see, the chickens are coming home to roost now, and this is not a small issue, and it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger until it leads us into World War III, and that's going to have to be stopped by Jesus Christ Himself. And then we have all the good news we can imagine. But it's going to be rough until that happens, but it's going to happen very soon. Notice what Corsi says in this final quote. He said, these resentments and fears are genuine, not concocted, and they have been signaled for a long time. Yes, they have, and we've signaled that more than anybody else. The only surprise is that the West seems to have been surprised by the Kremlin's actions over Crimea. See, the West is surprised. Well, what a surprise. Well, how could that be? But let me just give you a little history on how this all happened. Here's what I wrote in the booklet. The Serbs see clearly that Germany was behind the breakup of former Yugoslavia. We cannot forget that all Europe, the U.S. and the UN were against Germany when it recognized and strongly supported the breakaway of Slovenia and Croatia from Yugoslavia. But Germany prevailed. Croatia's breakaway led to civil war. America's Secretary of State at the time said Germany had a certain responsibility for the Yugoslav civil war. That was Warren Christopher. But he was quickly silenced, and no leader in our government has made such a statement since. What is it that we're not wanting to discuss? What is it about this infamous history we want to kick buried of what Germany did and the shame of America for letting them manipulate us the way they did, and now they have full control almost of the whole Balkan Peninsula, which is there by the Adriatic Sea, which leads them right out into the Mediterranean, where they have much greater ambitions than just in the Balkans, let me tell you. And Bible prophecy proves that. But what is wrong when Germany can, by themselves, turn all of Europe and the UN and America to their will? What weakness is that in America? God says that He is going to break the pride of our power. And so we just not only disagree with Germany, but then they turn us around and get us to support them and provide most of the power to destroy Yugoslavia and the rule of the Serbs. Now, that is our history. We don't like to discuss that part of it, but hey, it happened. And now it's all coming back to haunt us, just like you would expect it would. The world was shocked, but Vladimir Putin was enraged and still is to this day, because we get so, I think, hypocritical when somebody else does what we did to Yugoslavia. Here is a 2002, June 2002, Philadelphia Trumpet magazine, and that is a picture of Yugoslavia. And our feature article was the first victim of World War III. And that is what it amounts to. And you've got the maps there. And we had this powerful article, which was expanded into a booklet because it was so important. And yet, we got it so wrong. And I think we ought to listen to Vladimir Putin in that sense, although what he did in Crimea was a great crime. But I say to you, we committed a greater one. Just by looking at the facts, and I'm trying very hard to be just as objective as I possibly can be. These are facts. They're not some emotional opinion of someone. And yet people still will not face those facts. Here's what, like the German Foreign Minister Ruh called for a firm deadline to intervene there, and he said there was all kinds of concentration camps and the like. And he said, now look, we must avoid to be dependent on a Russian veto. We should get away from that. We should not let them stop us. And Russia remembers. Vladimir Putin remembers. And he knows a lot. He knows what really happened there. He just doesn't talk about Germany as much because he knows it was America's power that did it. So we refused to go to the Security Council of the UN, and we also said NATO, when they need to do something, he went on to say that, we don't need to look to Russia for support. We must do it. And he convinced America, the rest of Europe, and the UN that that's the way it should be. A shameful, shameful part of our history. The Germans even talked about, these leaders, German leaders, talked about the Serbs were committing genocide, trying to destroy whole races. And later, those statements proved to be just full of lies and deceit. Those are the facts. Those are the facts. See, afterwards it proved to be just that. So we wrote that the NATO attack on Belgrade in 1999 succeeded in forcing the Yugoslav government to make peace with the Kosovo separatists. They too were separating away from Yugoslavia. See, so everything was being forced, just like Putin is forcing Crimea to do what he wants today. But that happened, and you can see why Vladimir Putin says we are guided by the rule of the gun. And that, to my mind, was a shameful chapter in the history of America and of Europe, for that matter, and of the United Nations. Shameful chapter. We wrote, state by state, the country of Yugoslavia has been conquered. Even the name Yugoslavia has been discarded. You don't even see Yugoslavia on a map anymore. They've discarded the name. Everything, blotted it out because Germany wanted it done. Germany, who started 2 world wars and made Nazi puppets of Croatia and Slovenia, whom they recognized, and caused them to break away from Yugoslavia. Now that it ought to be a little scary to people if they just look at some history. Forget about Bible prophecy for a moment and just look at history and see what a warning is inherent in that history. And these are facts. I tell you, they are facts. And here's what I think it was the president of the European Union at the time. He said, but in the long run, Balkans belong strictly to the EU, he said. Oh yeah, not to America, not to all of Europe or the UN or anything like that. No, not that. And then Stratfor even wrote that was a rebirth of German fascism. See, Stratfor is probably the best reporters of intelligence, giving us intelligence today in the whole world as far as I'm concerned. And that's what he had to say about that time and what was going on. But who's listening? Who's really listening? Listen to this. This is from the booklet, strong German support for Croatian independence from Yugoslavia and Croatia's adoption of the hymn Danke Deutschland when that independence came in 1991 only reinforced Serbian misgivings. Croatia clearly knew its revolt succeeded because of Germany. They didn't say Danke NATO. They didn't say Danke America. They thanked the Germans because the Germans orchestrated all of it. And if you think Germany doesn't have greater ambitions than just there in the Balkans, well, you don't know what's really happening. Here we wrote a nice gift from the U.S., a whole page on that. Many people, they wonder why Germany is so quiet about all of this. And I think there's a very good reason for it, because they know what they did. They know what they did, and they know how they manipulated the whole world. And our booklet will straighten all of this out for you. It's a marvelous booklet, and I hope you'll read it. That is Germany's Conquest of the Balkans. Until next week, this is Gerald Flurry. Goodbye, friends.
Vladimir Putin is building the Russian bear back into a superpower. Europe and the West are frightened and have loudly criticized the Russian president for projecting his power and for taking Crimea away from Ukraine. President Putin claims that he's doing the same thing that the West did in Yugoslavia. In 1999, Germany forced a crisis that resulted in the United States bombing its former ally, Serbia. Does this Russian strongman have a good point? He does. The West's crime against Yugoslavia was far worse than Russia's takeover of Crimea. Gerald Flurry wrote specifically about this situation at the time in 1999. You need to request his booklet right now, Germany's Conquest of the Balkans. This free booklet shows you why what happened in Kosovo is important to you today. Also request our free documentary DVD. Ask for the Trumpet Daily episode, Germany's Conquest of Europe. This video will show you how Germany is building its own superpower. Stay up to date with these prophetic developments in Russia and Europe. Request our free booklet and DVD. And for more literature, Key of David episodes, and daily updates, visit us online at thetrumpet.com. Make sure you request a subscription to the Philadelphia Trumpet. This monthly magazine brings you the latest prophetic news from Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world. You will receive no bill, no donation request, and no follow-up. As always, all of these publications and media are completely free. You can request all of this literature at the Trumpet website, or you can read it or download it right now.